Hey, my name is Lakshya Jain. I'm a partner at the elections agency Split Ticket. We write and model about political elections. We also survey them from time to time. And what we really just try to do is take a data centric approach to every single article and every single election that we can find in the United States so as to give our readers a better, less punditry informed view of what's really happening.
How did that get started?
So we were all on election Twitter, which is a site that it's really just like the wing of Twitter that has a whole bunch of nerds focusing on really obscure election stuff. They make maps, they look at historical elections, they discuss the motivations behind different demographic shifts and whatnot. And it's just a lot of political commentary. And me and two of the other partners there, Harrison Lavelle and Armin Thomas, we all got together and we realized that we really liked doing this and that Twitter was not an appropriate repository for such work. It didn't lend itself to the complexity of analysis needed. It was prone to people taking it extremely out of context, and there's only so much that you can do with 280 characters.
hmm
So what we did instead was that we started Split Ticket as a way for us to really focus our analysis more and give more deeper long form analysis.
And that's interesting because I feel like Twitter had really become a place for election data in the certainly in the post like rise of Nate Silver era, if we could call that an era, right? So the sort of 2012 onward, it seemed like that was really the place to go for the data itself, the commentary, the latest polls, all of that stuff. I also have like a Twitter list that's poll updates and things like that. What do you think it kind of had that changed? Was it just always like that? What's your take on what happened with election Twitter? Had it ever been a
I,
good place?
I think it's actually stayed roughly intact, which is really surprising. Even though a lot of people in the more liberal side of Twitter have decried Elon Musk's changes, and I'm not really much of a fan of many of them myself.
hmm
Um, I do feel like election Twitter has been remarkably robust because it's less about the platform and more about the community.
Mm.
And unless everyone starts leaving, no one is going to leave. And when it
Right.
started, right, like when Elon took over Twitter, there was this huge exodus to Blue Sky first, where everyone created accounts, but no one could make an account because it required a wait list. So everyone stayed on Twitter. And then when the site didn't really break, we were all like, well, I guess we're staying here. And that's kind of what happened. So it's actually stayed roughly intact. I would say that people always complain, oh, the quality has gone down or whatnot, but I actually don't really think so. I think
Mm.
that new analysts always come in and the old ones get grouchy because someone else is now getting attention and they have takes that they don't agree with. But really, once you control for the get off my lawn demographic, it's
Right.
remained pretty robust and a very interesting place. You just have to know when to filter the wheat from the chaff. So,
hmm
you got to remember a lot of these people are like 17, 18, 19 years old. So you're going to you're going to get takes from people who have not really participated in politics before the 2018 midterms, for example, or before the 2020 election. So
Right.
you really got to kind of adjust for that mentally when you process some of these things, and then it adds a lot of value.
hmm It's an interesting evolution because I feel like without actually telling you specifically how old I am, the site that predated 538 for a long time as the place for amateur prognosticators about election outcomes was 270 to win, right? That was the place with
Yeah.
the interactive map, and you could you could make your
Oh yeah.
guesses about what was a toss up and what
I
wasn't.
mean, that's where I started seeing it too.
hmm and then I think things got a bit more arguably sophisticated with the rise of forecasting as something that was a public exercise as opposed to something that political scientists, econometricians, and campaigns engaged in for their own purposes. And I'm curious about where you guys sit on that. I know you have a polling aggregator. Are you engaged in forecasting? Is that something that you're interested in?
Yeah, actually, we forecast basically every election we can. So we have our forecast up for the House and the Senate. We're
hmm
still working on the presidential one, but we believe that our punditry is not nearly sophisticated or accurate enough to justify people listening to that over everything else.
hmm
Whereas our models have more of a track record of being accurate. Our forecasts are nice too, but like our forecasts really even when we don't build models for it, we make sure to like do polling aggregates. We
Hmm.
run the math ourselves to make sure we really get a data focused view of it, because in our opinion, anyone can sit there and have a take,
Hmm.
but not too many people can cut through all the takes and show like, hey, this is actually what the data is showing. Now let's dive into why it's saying that, but you got to first anchor yourself to reality with the data you have. And that's
Hmm.
why I think forecasted models are really, really useful.
So maybe talk a bit about that. I think the kind of lay person, um, for one thing, I'm not sure they're altogether aware of the difference between, for instance, a polling average and a forecast. And they're not the same thing. I think they also
Yeah.
don't necessarily know the difference between the model and the forecast. Like the forecast is the thing that comes out of the model. And so these things kind of get talked about interchangeably. And then there's my qualitative researcher pet peeve is when people start talking about what the model wants, because the model doesn't want anything.
Yeah.
But the model designers might want some stuff. Like, like I think last week, Nate Silver had said something about the model is hungry for more, for higher quality polls in Pennsylvania. And I was like, you're hungry for higher quality polls in Pennsylvania, Nate. Um, and all of us politics junkies might well be. But maybe talk about how you think about constructing a model. Like, what was your process for building the models that you have for the congressional races or for the Senate races?
Yeah. So, well, to start with the difference between a polling aggregator and a model, right, which is your first question, is that a polling aggregator is less really predicting who will win and more showing what the state of play is according to the polls. So it basically gathers a whole bunch of polls and then it spits out a number saying, like, okay, this is what all the polls say right now about the election in this locality or in this state. So ultimately, like, that's the main thing that the polling aggregators do. They help you really get a view of the data unaltered by human eyes, really, and untainted by expectations about which way a race will shift or how polling error will go or whatever. It's
Mm-hmm.
just like the purest core look at the data is a polling average.
And so for that, how are you deciding which polls to aggregate? I know some folks like the New York Times have been very selective about which polls they want to include. Other folks are less selective. Some people apply weights even to their polling aggregators. Some people just do a total it up and divide it kind of approach.
Yeah.
How do you think about that process for the polling average or aggregator?
So for us, we take every single poll that's
Hmm.
there, except for two firms which I have methodological doubts about. And that's not really because they would change our aggregate, more just out of the process for it.
Mm.
Those were Trafalgar and ActiVote.
Hmm.
Now, what we do though is broadly we take every poll that we're confident in has, like, actual polling data and isn't just like, people clicking numbers on an app. So, and
Yes,
we don't
take this
like really,
survey to keep playing Candy Crush. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, to be completely honest, right? Like that type of sampling, river sampling, has its
Hmm.
places. And you can actually do that in political polls if you're very careful. What you really can't be doing is using that as the only way in which you're sampling.
Hmm.
That's the problem.
Hmm.
That's actually what ActiVote does. That's what I don't like about them. I'm like, there's no
Mm.
way you're getting an actual representative sample of the United States in general by people who download your app. Like you have like 100 reviews in the App Store. Come on.
Right.
But we don't, in broadly speaking, though, other than that, we don't really like to make judgments over what to keep or what not to keep. What we
Hmm.
do is we take every poll 538 reports and then we just put them through our aggregator, which weights on recency, quality, and the population that's surveyed. And really speaking, what we try to do is that we really we really try to give precedence and not precedence but preference in our aggregator
Hmm.
to the higher quality polls that have a track record, that are transparent with their data, because we can trust them more, right? There's
Hmm.
more to go off of to give you confidence that they're going to be right.
Right.
So what we do is, let's start with the factors we break down if you'd like.
Hmm.
So when it comes to recency, it's obvious that a poll taken today will be probably more reflective of the state of play than a poll taken by the same agency 5 weeks ago.
Right.
Um,
A lot has changed in 5 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at 5 weeks ago in this race, the nominee wasn't even Kamala Harris.
Right.
So we're really talking about the need to control for that. It's really important. Now, the other thing that we do after that is we control for the quality of the pollster. We already mentioned why we do that. Longer track record, more accuracy over recent elections gives you more confidence they're going to be right this time around.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a way of determining pollster quality ourselves. What we do is we take 538's ratings, which are very, very carefully curated and transparent about how they do it, and we take those. We control for population. So a poll of likely voters is probably more likely to be representative of the electorate than a poll of registered voters, because not every registered voter turns out, and pollsters have to make informed guesses about who's going to show up and who's not going to show up. And over time, those informed guesses have proven to be more or less pretty good, especially when you're compared to like not having any guesses at all. So we give polls of likely voters a little bit more priority. We also control for sample size. And I think the best way to describe this to listeners is that if you have a poll that surveys 100 people versus a poll that surveys 1,000, you're probably going to get a better sample from the poll that surveys 1,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we control for that. The last thing we do is we also control for a poll's partisanship, so house effects, just because in practice we found that Republicans tend to release Republican-leaning polls, Democrats tend to release Democratic-leaning polls, and so, it's just smarter in general to correct for that. And this kind of makes sense, right? If you're a political party, why would you release a poll if it's bad for you? In most cases, you don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you generally want to adjust them a little bit and then move on.
Right.
So that's why we weight what we do. And then once we do all of that, we take basically every poll 538 has, other than the two that we mentioned. So that's like 200 agencies. No, there's no other subjective decision from us on anything. And then we literally just release what the polling aggregator says on our website. And I should note, by the way, that the practice of excluding certain pollsters, given very good reasons to do it, is something that like even Nate Silver does, right? Like he doesn't take Qantas polls or SoCal Research. We take those. We just don't take two of the other ones that he does.
Okay. Interesting. And so then talk about what happens once you go from gathering up all of the polls and, there's that sort of state of play, snapshot in time in the aggregate view. And then there's, in a way, like that's the Rashomon version, right? We're going to blend, we're going to blend all the stories together and find out what we think is going on right now. The forecast is looking forward. What do we think is going to happen based on what we currently know? I have now been having enough conversations as we get closer and closer to the election with friends of mine who are less research minded, less politically engaged about, it's the inevitable march where people suddenly start becoming interested in the forecast and extremely wrapped around the axle about it. And it's like, these are still probabilities, right? Like lots of things could happen. You run the simulation 1,000 times, a lot of different things happen, a lot of different outcomes could take place. It is not let me back up. I think like in 2016, there were people who would read the 538 forecast and think that it was not a probability of 70% that Clinton would win. She was going to win 70% of the vote. I think people have gotten a little bit better at understanding what those numbers mean. But I think there's still kind of a funny thing where 60-40 sounds like a big divide, but it's not much better than a coin flip. And so like understanding probabilities is sort of tricky. Maybe talk about how you explain when you're talking to people that are not on elections Twitter and you're trying to describe what a forecast is and what it's for. How do you talk about it?
So I think what we try to do in every single bit of our writing is that, like, you're right, firstly, a forecast is often very often misunderstood by people. I mean, even now I see when Nate Silver puts up a 61% chance of Donald Trump winning, they say, oh, Trump is on track for a landslide. He's winning 61% of voters. And I'm like, no, that's not how this goes. He is not doing an election of like 150 million individual people that he's simulating and then saying Trump wins 61% of those. No, he is saying of all of the presidential elections he simulated, Trump wins 61% of those in the aggregate, but he could win them by 1%, 2%, 3%, or whatever. That has absolutely nothing to do with margin. Probability and margin are two completely different things.
Right.
And most people don't get that.
Yeah.
But where I have sympathy for readers is that I don't think that's unreasonable. I think that if you're a layperson who has much better things to do in their life than worry about Florida's 15th district, you're rightly going to be very confused when you look at websites that say, our model says Hillary Clinton is at 61%, or our model says that Joe Biden is at 78%, or our model says Kamala Harris is at 82%. This is language that modelers use all the time because they forget that the average reader is not like them.
Right.
So to me, yeah, it's kind of dumb. But yeah, it's understandable as to why people are making that mistake. The average layperson is not as informed as you are. And the solution is never to say my readers are dumb. The solution is to say, well, if that's what my readers think, I've got to correct it. And what's wild is that, like, it's really hard to calibrate probabilistic bounds. But in general, if a candidate has a 4 in 10 chance of winning an election, that's actually really good. If you were told that it's a 40% chance of rain when you leave your house, you would probably pack a jacket with a hood or an umbrella or something like that, right? Because it would be insane to leave your house without preparation.
Right.
Similarly, when a model says that a candidate has a 40% chance of winning, what it's saying is that this person has a really, really good shot. Now, more often than not, we would say it's probably unlikely that they would win, slightly unlikely, but we don't really have enough confidence to say that they won't. And in fact, we think that they have a very good chance of winning, and maybe we're just wrong on the information we have.
Right.
They're really telling you when it says 40%, we're making an educated guess that one person has a slight advantage, a clear but a slight advantage. And maybe there's some things we haven't factored in that, would tip it the other way.
So maybe talk a bit about how modeling works. I actually have someone I'm going to interview soon about just like Monte Carlo simulations in general, because I'm a nerd. But the process of modeling is a super interesting one to me for a variety of reasons. I did a kind of essay version of the show last week talking about one of the things that I wonder about with the kind of earliest models, which really come out of a kind of treating elections like markets, treating politics like markets, and assuming that a voter is a rational economic actor who's trying to maximize future returns, right? Like that's the thing that they're trying to do. Obviously, models have become more complicated than just like what was the GDP in the last 6 months and who's the incumbent. Like that, those kind of 2-factor questions are still there, but not necessarily the sole questions. Talk a bit about how you think what belongs in a model. How do you kind of because let me ask you a question here. Let me pause. The model is trying to model what the electorate is going to be like and what it's going to do. The other part of it, however, is what's the mental model for the members of that electorate for how they go about doing what they do. And so it seems like a lot of the metrics that are included in a model, depending on the different forecasters have different constellations of things or different weights they place on them, use a lot of data that is regularly reported from reliable sources, and they serve as proxies for other things that are going on in the voter's mind. But how do you think about the kind of disconnect between, or connection, if there is one, between those kind of data sources about what's going on in the economy, what's going on politically, what's going on socially, and how voters actually think about what it is that they're trying to do?
So I think to start with, what goes in a model is a little bit more subjective in a lot of cases than what people would think. And blocking yourself against that subjectivity is really, really important. Because yes, a model is math, but unless you're like factoring every single thing, like, like unless you're factoring in every single factor, like for example, like a polling aggregator would,
Mm-hmm.
it's very easy to pick certain factors and upweight them artificially so that one person can be shown to be ahead. A lot of amateur modelers do this.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I got started in this, I kind of fell into the same trap subconsciously. So I think it's really important to say that, like, when a model is there, it can be flawed, and you have to be really, really, really good at eliminating biases in your work. So let's start with that. What we try to do is we try to look historically at what has been the best predictor of the electorate. Polls are by and far the best,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not always just the polls that matter because polling is flawed, right?
Mm-hmm.
2020 kind of showed that there are some serious problems in the survey research field, which got exacerbated with COVID and really requires some extra work to be cognizant of and to account for. So what we like to do is we also look at other factors in the election beyond just polling. These are factors that are shown to have correlated historically very, very well with the result, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or a Republican that wins.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we don't decide the weights on our model ourselves. A lot of amateur modelers do. We tend to try and not do that.
Mm.
We really try to do something that's a little bit more like, let's train like a regression model, for example,
Mm-hmm.
on a series of different factors, which will take in spending, they'll take in maybe economic data, they could take in incumbency, they could take in past over performance.
Mm-hmm.
From there, what we do is we then understand how much each factor matters. Then we blend that with polling.
Mm-hmm.
And that tends to give us the best set of results. Historically, that's just been one of the better predictors. It's what 538 does too, in taking like fundamentals and polling together, right? And it's what Nate Silver does at Silverbolt, and
Mm-hmm.
it's what the best election models do. You take a mix of the fundamentals and you take a mix of polling.
Mm-hmm.
And what you find overwhelmingly is that polling matters much more, but that when there's some real detachment between what the fundamentals say and what the polling says, sometimes the fundamentals can actually drag the polling numbers back to reality and say, hang on, you're probably missing something here. It seems like those polls, maybe they're right, but on balance, when this detachment has happened, they've been too good for the party winning. So they drag them back a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
That would have helped in 2020 a lot.
Yeah. So are there things that are kind of, this is just a kind of an odd question maybe, but are there things that are in a typical model that you include because they, they're in the usual models, but you're skeptical about?
So it started off like that, and then eventually when I found like they didn't help much, I got rid of it. One
Mm-hmm.
example is we looked at crosstabs for every single poll and every election cycle. And we took the exit polls for every election, we plugged in those crosstabs and into like the next election's forecast, and we're like, did that have any value?
Mm.
Turned out no.
Hmm.
Or you can take pre-election polls, and you can take pre-election polls, crosstabs, plug them into a model. Does that have any value? Again, it turns out the answer is actually no, not after you account for everything else. So we got rid of that. We actually have a leaner model. We have like 11 total things that we account for, 10 or 11 things.
Mm-hmm.
And each of those add significant value to the forecast. So everything that we add now that other people add, it's because we found significant value in doing it.
When you say putting the crosstabs into a model, is that sort of assigning weights by demographics? Is that what you mean by
Correct.
that? Yeah.
Correct. You look at margins per demographic, and then you look at the share of the electorate that these things typically make up.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can assemble like an estimate like that. But
Yeah.
in practice, that's actually tended to not nearly be as informative as I would have thought.
Mm. So this takes me to another part of the challenge of all of this, obviously, which is the way we actually select presidents. which is not by a national popular vote. And I am currently still trying to track down a British pollster because they were all up in the MRPs this year for their elections as a method of modeling the outcomes. I don't think it was super accurate in the end, but it was certainly, I mean, it wasn't really a mystery who was going to win the parliamentary elections this year. Um,
Yeah.
and I think there was plenty of kind of past evidence to suggest that if you're walking into the polls thinking it's a landslide, then a whole lot of people are going to stay at home. So it wasn't as much of a landslide as was predicted. But the thing that I find interesting about it is that it is, first of all, massive sample sizes. I don't know how they're collecting samples, so I don't know how they're able to afford it, and that's my biggest question for them. But because if you're doing it off of voter file, the way we do it here, it becomes extremely expensive. The or maybe I would just say more expensive than media companies typically want to shell out for. The other part of the challenge, it seems to me, for us in making predictions about electoral outcomes is just the electoral college of it all. You know, how are any of these factors distributed around the country? How are any of these demographic characteristics distributed around the country? Turnout slash demographics slash preferences historically. I know that basically we have these kind of shorthands that are like, if the Democrats are leading by at least 4, then they'll probably be safe in the electoral college. But if it's less than that, it's just as likely that the Republicans will lose the popular vote and win the electoral college. That if, Arizona is going a particular kind of way, then New Mexico, well, maybe not New Mexico, but I don't know, like those two states look a lot alike. And so maybe they'll kind of go in a similar direction, or the blue wall states tend to hang together, though not always. How do you think about that part of the complexity? It doesn't seem to kind of enter into most of the models exactly, but maybe it's just that it's not transparent to readers that it is part of the model.
So I guess, are you asking more about like turnout assumptions and how that factors into building a model? Is that?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think it's also just a question of, if you've got a 60-40 forecast and that's based on national polls, then it's basically a coin toss, and that doesn't necessarily tell you much about, therefore, who's winning the electoral college, right? It,
Yeah.
it might tell you that it's like a lean when whoever's on the 60% side, but it doesn't, like there. That I think is one of the other places where the average reader finds themselves questioning the value of polls and forecasts when, the forecast says it's 65% for Harris, and the final vote is, 2 points behind what the last poll said it was, and she barely wins the popular vote and loses the electoral college. Like, you can't trust the polls is the headlines the next day, right? So
Yeah.
I'm curious about, like, it seems like it's because there isn't this additional part of like modeling the states. And obviously there are places that do it, but it doesn't kind of, it's complicated, it's expensive,
Well,
it's
that
hard to
happens though,
report.
right? Like that people do model the states. The problem is they don't model them very well.
Mm,
Um, there's, each election campaign has people working on this exact thing. They have people trying to model the turnout
hmm
for any given state so that they can figure out, right, like what's the electorate going to look like. That can inform their polling. It informs their voter targeting strategy. It informs basically their messaging, advertising, everything that they can do.
hmm
And the thing is that, like, empirically, it's been shown that even though, yeah, they may say, like, yeah, it's helped a little bit, and it probably has. Um, there's a difference between like something helping versus not helping. Like, yeah, sure, it helps, and something being accurate.
mm-hmm.
And I think where people mess up on in evaluating these things is that these are really, really, really hard things to predict. These are really hard things to understand. These are things that even the best election agencies struggle with.
hmm
One thing people like to use is self-reported vote in every state, right? Or
hmm
self-reported vote likelihood in every state. It says, like, are you likely to vote or not?
Right.
Well, in 2020, 97% of registered voters in polls were saying, I'm definitely going to vote.
Right.
That's just not true. Like, We get like 65, 70% registered voter turnout, and that's big
Mm-hmm.
nationally. I
Yep.
think 2020 was 66%, and that was huge. It's just flatly not true that 34%, that 97% of people are going to show up. So the
Mm-hmm.
question is, how else do you model that? One thing that has proven to be really predictive is past voting history. If you voted in the past, you are very likely to vote in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in any given election, about 15% of the electorate turns over from the previous one. Some of them
Right.
forget to vote. Some of them just don't vote. Some of them show up after not showing up the previous time. I mean, think about this. 2020 was extraordinarily high turnout.
Mm-hmm.
In 2022, 10% of the voters didn't even vote in 2020.
Right.
And people don't remember this. People will say, I voted, and they didn't. Or they'll
Mm-hmm.
say, I voted for the guy who won, and they didn't. This is
Right.
winner's recall. It's very, very common.
Yeah.
Um, so that's why these things are really, really difficult, because if you take people's words, which is really like you should think you should be able to trust a person, you turn out to be very wrong in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to get a little bit more sophisticated. You've got to drill down and figure out, like, how are these people going to vote? What are they, and are they going to vote? What are their characteristics? What, did they have a degree? Did they vote in the last 3 elections? Are they a midterm voter? Did they vote in a primary? You plug in all those factors, and then you get a better assumption, a better understanding of whether these people are going to show up. And that's how you can model the likely electorate in a much, much better way. And then
Mm-hmm.
I should note, even after that, that's a good guess. And that's what a lot of more sophisticated modelers do. That's what the best people on campaigns do. But even then, there's a lot of room for those things to be wrong. And by wrong, you may say, like, oh, that's very close to accurate. Sure, but the election's decided by 2%.
Right.
So even a
Right.
small difference could really play some havoc with what happens. If you undershoot black turnout by 3% in Georgia or by 2%, well, you've already lost 1 to 2% of margin for Democrats right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the
Right.
difference between a lean R and a toss-up election.
Right. Right. So maybe let's talk about this piece that you and your colleague had in. I want to make sure I'm not screwing it up. I live in the universe of Politico and Axios are the same thing. They are not, but it was in Politico a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, maybe.
Yeah.
That was talking about looking at the 2024 polling crosstabs, and in particular looking at the pre-Biden dropout to the post-Biden dropout, introduction of Harris polls, and maybe just talk a bit about why you went through that exercise. It's not a small amount of work.
Yeah. To us, Harris was gaining a lot, and we wanted to understand, like, who was it that didn't want to vote for Biden that was voting for Harris? There was a lot of people who didn't want to vote for Biden. He was trailing by 3 points by the end of this, which was like a 7-point swing right from 2020.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, who was it that was actually saying, like, I wasn't going to vote for Biden, but I'll vote for Harris? And we looked, and it actually gave a lot of insight into, like, why certain things were happening the way they were, right? Like, why for all of a sudden the Sun Belt became competitive again. Whereas with Biden, he'd almost completely ceded that.
Mm.
To us, that was really instructive. That was telling us, like, oh, wow, okay, Kamala Harris makes a lot of gains among young Black and Latino voters. That's why she is making big gains in the Sun Belt, because that's where a lot of those people live. So to us, an exercise like that really illustrated the nature of the shift for Harris and how completely and comprehensively she reshaped the electoral map.
Mm. And you saw that across a variety of demographic, subtypes. So there were young voters shifting. There were independent voters shifting. That one was pretty interesting. There
Oh
was
yeah.
Shifts for both college and non-college. I mean, there were sort of places where, there was definitely for a while there in the spring a sense that Biden was going to win because the over 65s were on side with him, and that's kind of obviously shifted around. So young voters a bit more on side with Harris than they were with, quite a bit more than they were with Biden, but seniors maybe started to trail off a bit. We'll see what happens over the next, where are we now? 6 weeks. But what do you make of those differences? Is it just down to everybody was really unhappy with their choices? Is there some other kind of way of that you notice those shifts is really interesting. What do you think it means?
I think to some degree, some people really weren't going to vote for Biden. I mean, it's important to remember that we were asking Americans to vote for an 82-year-old,
Mm-hmm.
and the opposition was Donald Trump, which is why he kept it so close.
Right.
But like, age-based penalties are nothing new. If you look at the history of elections, every time a really old person runs, they face some trouble. Dianne Feinstein in 2018 was running against Kevin De Leon, and like, I'm a Democrat, so I was paying very close attention to that primary. And I remember being very surprised that Feinstein was running. And even though I didn't like De Leon, I actually voted for him because I didn't want Feinstein in office. I thought she was
Mm-hmm.
too old to be a senator.
Yeah.
And that's me, like one of the most engaged voters in American politics.
Mm-hmm.
That's not said as a compliment.
Right.
So now if I'm thinking like that and I vote for someone who I have pretty serious ideological differences with, because I think the person who's an incumbent senator from my party is too old, right? And De Leon's also a Democrat, but he's a significantly different type of Democrat than Feinstein is.
Mm.
What are we really asking American voters to do? What are we talking about with the fringe voters who rarely show up to vote? What are we asking about with young voters who don't pay that much attention to politics, are ideologically like left leaning, but are really just disengaged more than anything? Are they going to even show up?
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is that when you start looking at independents, who are probably the group that is most likely to look at image instead of like concrete policy proposals, well, the image of Biden being flailing on the debate stage or stuttering and being really, really almost incoherent, unfortunately, was a very, very tough thing to sell them on.
Mm-hmm.
You can't realistically sell them on this and say, we'd like you to vote for him because the opposition is Donald Trump, because that works on engaged voters. We know that voters who participated in a primary election or who voted in the midterm were actually shifting to Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
Well, voters who participated in a primary were shifting to Democrats. Voters who participated in the midterm were really holding steady.
Mm-hmm.
But voters who didn't vote in 2020, they were shifting hard to the right.
Mm.
And that group had suddenly become Republican leaning. Harris, what she has done is she has injected a different messenger into it. The message is not actually that different. The message is actually very similar. She's proposing the same things Biden proposed, but she's doing it as Kamala Harris, who is a 59-year-old woman.
Mm-hmm.
She's not doing it as an 82-year-old white man who is in visible decline.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why she does better. It's about the image and it's about the messenger more than it is about the message.
Those kinds of things seem like, I don't know, maybe it is because I do mostly qualitative research myself. I mean, we have a quant team, but the thing that we all find valuable is the actually talking to people about how they muddle through stuff. And in that you realize how much they're muddling, right? Like they're people often don't, even just thinking about those they weren't progressives. They were independent voters in Pennsylvania focus groups I did in 2017, 2018, maybe. They were, they thought that the person that they were going to vote for Congress was going to do something about the potholes on the county road. They're not, right? Like that's up to the county supervisor. Potholes were very present in everyone's minds because it was spring on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So potholes are the first words that come out of everyone's mouths. But there were also just sort of basic confusion about who's in charge of which kinds of taxes, who's in charge of which kinds of functions of government. And then a whole lot of other things that are totally, I know it's become fashionable in the last couple of years to talk about the vibe economy and, all of those kinds of things, but it's always vibes. Like fundamentally, you get to talk to people who are, I think this was the moment where I started to think that maybe a lot of so-called independent voters are kind of just less politically engaged voters. And they are more swingy, less committed to one particular side or the other, on the fence about, they're more clear that their choices are threefold at least. They've got Democrat, Republican, or not voting. And the thing that was fascinating in talking to them was about how little really was about policy, right? It was more of, I like that guy. He talks like a normal person. It's time for someone
Yeah.
new. Just like basic ideas of wanting something different. Whatever's going on right now doesn't feel great, so let's try something else. But not a real kind of like rational economic man kind of calculus about how they were gonna do whatever they were gonna do in the polling place, and I wonder about like obviously these things are tricky to quantify if nothing else. They tend not to um, necessarily be things we even think to ask about until after you start hearing about it in focus groups. I mean, even the question about are these two candidates too old took a while to show up in the polling. It didn't, we weren't asking that question, for example, in 2020 that much. Um, and so, it seems like there's all the kind of ineffable, qualitative, vibey aesthetic things that voters take into consideration when they're looking at their choices. When I was a kid, the joke was the taller candidate wins, which also as a Democrat, I hope is not true this year. But they, those kinds of things are kind of undeniable. People have heuristics and biases that drive their decisions all the time. And I don't even know how you would begin. I mean, I do have a theory. Like you'd have to start asking people questions on polls about those heuristics and biases in a way that doesn't flag to them that like you're going to look like an idiot if you answer it this way, and then do that enough over time, and everyone does it kind of the same way to be able to compare those pieces in order to incorporate these more aesthetic, less measurable in public data ways factors into a model, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, but it seems like these are some of the funny kind of X factors. Like a lot of the conversation about will the forecasts be quote unquote accurate this year have a lot to do with, are we guessing correctly about what the turnout's going to be and who's going to be doing the turning out? The same thing is true of the questions, at the end of 2020 when APOR did their audit to try to figure out why the polls were off. And they were like, well, gosh, we solved for non-college representation in the polls. We think there's not much shy Trump voter stuff going on. So, gosh, we just don't know. It must be non-response
Yeah. They
bias.
just threw their hands up. They're like, we have no idea. And what was even more confusing to them is when 2022 polls were completely fine. And then they were
Mm-hmm.
like, what happened there?
Well, and I think a simple, not quite answer to that question is likely voters vote in midterms and less likely voters vote in generals.
Yeah,
And so
exactly. I mean,
the
it's so hard
yeah.
to tell.
And this is to go back to your point about even figuring out what a likely voter is based on self-report, uh, is like I'm
Just
definitely
doesn't
going to go
work.
vote is like a lot of things could happen between now and election day. You could get sick, a family member could die, you could change jobs. Like there's a million reasons why you don't go vote that are not just like I forgot to and I don't care enough.
Yeah.
They are instead like legit reasons. And it rained that day and I don't own an umbrella, whatever. There's a million reasons
Yeah.
why people don't go vote in the end. It's very hard to predict what that's going to be. And it seems to me that the problem with sample right now may simply be we've run to the limit of what we can estimate in terms of who will actually come out and vote in the end. And so maybe we're just at a place where we're sort of fiddling the dials, but we're going to stay within this kind of 2.5, 3 points margin of accuracy, where like that's the best we can do. And some years it'll be a little bit off because of the ineffable.
Absolutely. People are guessing in this industry more than they would like to admit. Even when they're not putting their own subjective judgments into it, they're still guessing.
Mm-hmm.
They could build the best models they can, but at the end of the day, there are certain variables that we just don't understand. There are things that we don't even know that are dividing lines in the electorate that really matter.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things play into it. And part of the problem is that, like, fundamentally, polling a voter is about trusting a voter.
Mm-hmm.
And what you find with some things is that there's some areas where you literally cannot trust a voter. Like if you're doing phone polls and you're asking someone how likely are they to vote and who did you vote for in 2020? Well, you'd be surprised at how many people say that they voted in 2020 and that they voted for Joe Biden when they didn't vote or when
Mm-hmm.
they voted for Trump. In 2018 and 2020, consistently, the New York Times said that they found people would give answers that did not match up with what the reality would suggest.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They would say, "Oh, I voted for Trump in 2016. Now I'm voting for Biden." And they're like, "Really? I don't think all of you did that."
Right, right.
um, yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing there then makes me, unfortunately, go back to even sort of the concept of, um, to some degree, this project of creating Crosstabs began with trying to explain margin of error over the holidays to my mom and my husband. And like that there is sort of sample error, and then there's all these other forms of error. Some of these things aren't exactly necessarily, I mean, they're sort of error, but it's like if you know that 80+% of registered voters are going to tell you that they voted, that they're definitely going to vote, but we know that's not what turnout is. Like maybe you can run a scenario where it's optimistic and it's a 2 to 5 point bump in turnout. My God, that would be amazing. If it dropped off a bit because people aren't that enthusiastic, it's 2 to 5 in the other direction. Like these are significant enough swings that on that basic question, that question all of a sudden has a pretty significant margin of error. And
Absolutely.
then you have the same thing with other stuff of people's accuracy of recollection. Who did I vote for last time? Gosh, I think it was Biden, but I don't remember for sure. I didn't like him at the time. I voted for Trump. I decided I liked Biden later. I must have voted for Biden. Like I have family members who do this all the time
Yeah.
about the 80s, frankly, where they are now insistent that they did not vote for Reagan. And I can tell you
It's
for
like, no, you
sure
probably
that
did.
they did. But in any
I've seen this
case,
with a lot of liberals and George Bush too.
yes, exactly. And I think these things start to make me wonder about even just the articulation of some of these findings of if you know that there's some 15 to 20 point gap between the people who are actually going to vote and the people who say they're going to vote, shouldn't that affect your math on the rest of it? If you know that there's a 10% error rate on people's recollections about who they voted for previously, and because we don't record who people voted for in public records, shouldn't that just kind of get added into the math of the rest of it? Or does that just start to make the error bars so wobbly and wide that the New York Times would never?
I think the New York Times doesn't wait actually for that reason.
Mm,
Yeah, like they don't wait on recalled vote for that exact reason
hmm.
because it's not a reliable metric in their polls. Now in
Yeah.
panels, I've seen that it actually helps a lot with panels where when you have voters opting in to take a sample, that control, firstly, they're more engaged, and secondly, like that control is pretty important
Hmm.
because it's an opt-in frame, right? Like it's not, you don't have like L2 modeled party ID that you can vote for, like which is what the
Mm,
Times does.
right.
Um, with that said, with all of that said, I think like there's no right answer to this. I have seen very good pollsters wait for recalled vote. We wait for recalled vote when we do our surveys on panels.
Hmm.
Ultimately, it's because it still provides a better metric of partisanship and gets you in the right ballpark than, you know, the alternative would, which is that like you just don't, which is that you kind of make up party ID targets and then work from there. If we had the L2 voter file, we would consider voting to modeled party ID. We did that once for a poll. We were pretty happy with it, but it really depends on the data set you have, right? Like if you don't trust your data set's partisanship identification metric, you're probably not going to want to wait to it.
Hmm.
So this is the problem. When people are modeling Michigan and Wisconsin, a lot of those voter files apparently tend to really overweight Democrats. Like they think people are much more
Mm,
Democratic than they are. Um, and this kind of leads to some problems, right? In fact, I think this is why, in general, polling still has so much variance because people can never really agree on something. Two pollsters, three opinions,
right. Yeah.
right? Like that's why.
Yeah. Well, and you had that sort of famous thing that Nate Cohn and the Times published right after 2016, I think, that was about we asked 4 different pollsters to estimate the margin of error on the exact same survey instrument and set of data, and they all came up with different
Yeah,
MOEs, right? Um, this then leads me to another kind of question about the probabilities then. And the thing I think about a lot is um, like there's sort of a probability expression scale that apparently historically, I don't know if they still do or not, the CIA used, right? Where it was like 0% is impossibility, 100% is certainty, 93% give or take, 5% or something is almost certain, 7% give or take 5% is almost certainly not, 5% give or take 10% is about even. And so I wonder about things like, instead of actually putting numbers in front of people who don't know what the numbers represent, why forecasters don't say if it's within 40 and 60, it's about even with a slight lean, instead of saying the numbers. And then if it's, somewhere between, I don't know, 65 and 85%, then it's a probable win. If it's, 85 plus, then it's almost certain that that person's going to win. But, using those kinds of, and maybe again, speaking as a qualitative researcher, I often rephrase Likert scales in people's real language because,
Oh, yeah.
very, somewhat, neither, somewhat, very is not really how people think about their opinions with things. Um, but I'm just curious about, like, why not kind of have a layperson translation of the probabilities where they don't get wrapped around the axle of the numbers.
Well, I think they should. I think people should. And this is something we're going to do,
Mm.
where we're going to actually say, like, this person has a 67% chance of winning winning the election. For context, that's like the same odds of like Shohei Ohtani getting on base.
Right. Okay.
And that's like, that's actually pretty helpful to the average
Yeah.
viewer, right? Because that type of thing helps them understand how likely or unlikely something is.
Hmm.
I guess given the way Otani's been hitting some of these seasons, maybe they might think, oh, that's definitely going to happen. That aside, I think you get my point,
Yeah.
right? Which is
Yeah.
that, like, when you put those probabilities up, if you're careful about the way that you express them, that's actually something we plan on doing, because it just gives people a more realistic frame of understanding what's really going to happen.
Hmm. And so one of the other things that I think is interesting is this year has been the year of a new phrase that I feel like has been popularized. I'm sure people were saying it in the last cycle too, but crosstab trutherism.
Oh, that happens every election.
Yes, but I feel like, you've got the pod save guys talking about it a lot more and that kind of thing. But this
Yeah.
kind of a little bit of a public shaming of anybody who's going to try to go into the crosstabs and try to figure out what's going on as a non-pollster. And I guess I'm curious about what you think is useful for someone looking at the crosstabs. I mean, most of these public pollsters, not most of them, many of them are publishing their crosstabs now. Some still don't. They just give you the top lines. But I'm curious what you think about that for an interested, more politically minded person. Why would they want to have a look at crosstabs?
I think because crosstabs ultimately are actually probably the most useful thing about a poll. This is
Mm.
going to sound insane, but it's one thing to say, like, oh, well, about 53% of Georgia residents want to vote for, let's say, Kamala Harris. That would be, to be fair, that would be actually a very high number. But let's say they say, like, oh, this poll will tell you 49% of Georgia residents are going to vote for Kamala Harris. Okay, sure. But you can get that anyways from a whole host of things, right? Once the election happens, you can actually take a look and you can figure out, like, oh, that's what's going to happen, or
Mhm.
that's what happened. What you can't do with, like, election results is you can't see which groups drove that 49%. You can't see which people of which characteristics wanted to vote for Kamala Harris. What crosstabs do, and they're better in post-election validated voter polls and
Mhm.
studies than, anything else, is they tell you what the breakdown is going to be like. They tell you, for example, that black voters would drive any Harris victory. Black voters in Atlanta and in Georgia in general drive the majority or a significant chunk of Democratic votes in the state. So this is the type of thing that you learn from crosstabs. You learn, for example, how educated voters tend to vote. You learn how black voters tend to vote. You learn that Democrats are still winning Latino voters despite the articles that come out day after day after day. Yes, they're losing some ground with them, but they're still winning the group.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the type of stuff that you would learn with crosstabs. That's the
Mm.
type of thing you cannot get from the top line. It is true that for figuring out who's going to win an election, the crosstabs are useless.
Mm-hmm.
That is true. But then this is a question of what you want a poll to do. Do you want a poll to just tell you who's going to win because you don't have the election results yet, so you need to know like what to expect? There's an argument for that. Then I would say don't look at the crosstabs.
Mm-hmm.
If you want a poll to inform you about who's driving, electoral power in each state, who's swinging which way, then you need the crosstabs. And maybe you want
Mm.
to wait for after the election so you can say, cool, now I know who won. Now I don't need to rely on a poll to tell me that Harris is winning 49% of Georgia voters, but who drove that victory? Well, let's look at the
Mm-hmm.
post-election validated voter studies and look at the crosstabs for those, and we could see. Or maybe before the election comes around, you want to understand what to brace yourselves for. And then you can see, oh, well, okay, I see like white voters are roughly holding steady from 2020 despite Harris losing some ground. Now, why is that?
Mm-hmm.
That to me is the real value of crosstabs. They tell you the compositional breakdown, and nothing else can do that.
So do you do a lot of comparison between not I mean the piece that you published was comparing crosstabs pre-Biden dropping out, post Harris getting in. The look at something like the post-election validated voter studies, those crosstabs to what the crosstabs look like right now. Like, do people make those comparisons to the kind of the after the fact? This is what the electorate looked like, more or less, in 2020. This is how those same groups are behaving in polls. Saying they're going to behave. Reporting themselves in polls now. Is there value in looking at those things to try to see where there's weakness and strength in the parties of the campaigns?
Yeah, this is what campaigns do all the time. They have
Mm-hmm.
to look at the crosstabs because they have to see, for example, like, are we doing well with black voters, for example? Are we doing badly? So, for example, right, as a Democrat, if I look at Kamala Harris's polling and I see that she's losing 11 points of ground with black voters in quality surveys, to me, that's a big red flag. Then
Mm-hmm.
I would actually say, like, okay, what would she need to do in order to recover? Because that's the type of thing that will tell you, hey, you may be at 49%, but you should be careful that like you are losing a significant amount of ground with this demographic. Maybe you should do some appeals to repair your standing with them.
Right.
So
This, I think, gets to my kind of final set of questions for you, which is about the purpose of these things and who they're really for. And maybe borrowing a baseball analogy here, there's like, the person who's interested enough in baseball to go, who won last night? There's the person who's a little more interested, who wants to know what the score was. There's someone who's more interested in that, who's going to look at the box scores and know what they mean. um, and that's going to tell them something about, it's in a way, it's going to kind of recreate the game for them in their minds. Then there's somebody who's going to want to like really get into the sabermetrics side of all of this. And, from where I sit, I guess my question is like, sure, there are those of us who just like enjoy looking at data sets. And then there's everybody else. And it seems to me when you start getting into that level of detail, I start to wonder who is that for besides the campaigns themselves, the baseball manager, and the betting markets. Like besides people placing bets on games and the managers, who needs this level of granular detail? Who needs forecasts?
this is a good question. I think the people that need forecasts, primarily, I think journalists really need it because you can't report on what's going to happen without understanding what is really what the data is really saying. You can't just trust the vibes of people who you know and saying like, well, my cousin says that he's voting for Harris and he's always voted for Republicans before. So I think Democrats are making serious inroads with non-college white men.
Mm.
That's the type of stuff that used to pass over for analysis, by the way, 25 years ago.
Yes.
Forecasting has thankfully stopped a lot of that.
Peggy Noonan still wants it to work that way. So,
Yeah. I think
yard
the
signs
people,
and things.
we need polls and we need forecasts. We really need people to tell us this is what the data says. This is what the best set of factors that have historically predicted elections say about this current one. You can frame a lot of what's going on through that lens, in a sense, you can understand a lot of movement and a lot of decisions being made politically and otherwise through that lens. Right? You need to understand why an election, in order to write about why an election is going a certain way, you need to
Mm-hmm.
actually know whether it is going that way.
Right. Right.
And this helps inform the public. And the truth is, if the public didn't care about politics, maybe my answer would be different. But the public cares about politics. They care about
Mm-hmm.
it a lot, and it impacts their daily lives. Knowing who's more likely to win shapes the way that you talk to people. It shapes the actions that you do. It shapes the purchases you make. It shapes the way in which you interact with things. It changes everything, really. And I think that's why we need good forecasts.
Mm-hmm. What's something if you well, not even if you guys are actually in a position to do so, what is something you would like to change about the way forecasting works? What's the kind of contribution you're hoping to make to this relatively young, at least in the public sphere, field?
We think that past that candidate strength should be accounted for a lot more. We think that really people don't account for specific candidates and their weaknesses and strengths in a
Mm,
proper way. What we're really trying to contribute to is the fact that when you're trying to understand whether people want to vote for someone or not, you have to look at whether they've done that before and how this person has appealed to a certain locality or a certain group before. And in doing that, if you can build that into your model instead of just vibe casting it away, that actually informs a lot of what the future will tell, what your forecast will say about the future. That's the thing that we're trying to bring into the forecasting field.
hmm. And what kind of advice would you give to someone who is interested in politics, but maybe not totally, they don't have a Twitter list set up for election Twitter. They're just getting the feed. What advice would you give to them for thinking about how to engage with polls and averages and forecasts?
I think the advice that I would give is just embrace uncertainty. Realize that if a candidate is up by two, it really means that the election is going to be very, very close. Maybe
Hmm.
the candidate that's up has an advantage, but it doesn't mean that they put it away. Embrace uncertainty and realize that anything can happen, but just because anything can happen doesn't stop you from making careful assessments about who is ahead based on the balance of evidence. It doesn't mean that you can say, oh, polls don't matter because Biden was up by 8 and he only won by 4. No,
Hmm.
we can be a little bit more careful than that, and a little bit more judicious in our understanding of elections in this.
Hmm.
So I would just say embrace uncertainty and realize that a lot of things can happen, but don't let that really let you toss out all the data and say anything will happen.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that people should be using these kind of data as a bellwether for their own voter behavior? Either,
No,
okay.
no, absolutely
Good.
not. Absolutely not. I think the choice that people should make is independent of whether or not, they think someone is going to, whether or not they think a party is going to win. I will say that the one place where I differ here is that I think that if you're thinking of voting for a third party, you may want to use these to actually inform your choice, because a
Mm,
third party vote can actually seriously impact an election and is basically like, it's basically hurting your own side if you have a
hmm.
side in order to not pick it. So if you're thinking about casting a protest vote, but you want to see a party win, well,
Right.
first of all, I would say people should just vote for the party they want to win. But secondly, if you're worried about someone coming in, then and you're thinking about voting third party, then use these forecasts and then say like, okay, well, if the race is going to be close in my state, maybe it makes more sense for me to just pick one of the two sides that is going to win so
Mm,
that my
hmm.
vote can have an impact. But no, in terms of should it make you vote Democratic or Republican based on whether one side is up? No, that would be preposterous.
Okay, good. I sometimes feel in conversations with people like they think that that's, if not like which party to vote for, it's this like, is there any point in me voting? Is
No,
a way that
that
people look
is
at these numbers sometimes.
no, that's ridiculous. It's got to be a way of civic expression too.
Hmm. Yeah. Laksha, thank you so much for talking to me. I know we're at the hour. What's a good way for people to keep up with your work?
Thanks so much for having me. I would say the best place to follow what we're doing is split-ticket.org. It's our website. We post all types of election analysis and models there. So if people want to check it out, that would be fantastic. Thanks for having us on, Farah.
Yeah, thank you. Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farah Bostic, production by The Difference Engine, and edited now by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly Substack, also available at crosstabspod.substack.com. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, and give the show a rating or review. I would love to hear from you, and it will help other people find the show. Email me if you have any questions, ideas for episode topics, suggestions for future guests, or want to talk about ways we can work together at farah@crosstabspodcast.com. See you next time.